All right, we have one of our channel favorites back on today, Ray McGovern. He is former CIA. He also used to do the security briefings for President Ronald Reagan. He has a wealth of experience with Washington, D.C. and national security. And I appreciate him coming on because there's so much going on in the Russia-Ukraine war right now that I would love to get your insight on that. Ray, thank you so much for being on today's show.
Most welcome, Stephen.
Okay. So tell me if you know anything about this, but I'm hearing and I'm reading that the head of the Wagner mercenary group, Prigozhin, may have been misled by the CIA and MI6 that if he went after Vladimir Putin and used his men to threaten to march on Moscow or to actually march on Moscow, that he would be given assistance. And now he's had to escape to Belarus for his life. They're going back and forth on what should happen with the Wagner group and with Prigozhin. Do you have any background or insight on this claim that might be helpful?
Well, Stephen, I think the simplest answer is often the best in intelligence, and that is that his group was being disbanded. He was losing his job. The Wagner troops were being folded into the regular army, which Prigozhin didn't like. Actually, the Russians were coming down on some of his pet projects, on which he's making $1 billion a year, contracts with the Ministry of Defense. And he's a very irascible, very impetuous fellow. Now, uh, I leave open the possibility that he was in touch with Ukrainian liaison, and by definition, some CIA or MI6 people. And he said, I think I'm going to do this. So what do you think? And they sent cables back to Washington and London and said, my God, Prigozhin's going to march on Moscow. What should I say? Well, what's the downside for us? Nothing venture. Yeah, tell them go try it. But I don't think there was anything more in terms of controlling Prigozhin. You'd have to admit, you'd have to concede that MI6 and CIA are just crazy. I think they're not really well balanced. They're that crazy. Now, Prigozhin may have been led to believe that he had sympathizers in Moscow that would rise up and, really, really welcome him. But if you thought that, then he's not as clever a guy as I think he is. I think it was a desperate move to move in there, to declare his popularity, which is appreciable. You're making $2 billion a year. You're going to get a good PR machine. The people in Rostov-na-Donu, Rostov on the Don, they welcomed him. He's a hero, the hero of Bakhmut. Okay, so it was one reason why Putin wanted to treat him with kid gloves. He defused the situation, and now I just don't know what's going to happen. I think, or I have been thinking that Putin came out of this still stronger. But now I wonder, the reports today are that Prigozhin stormed into St. Petersburg to pick up his weapons, and now is on his way to Moscow. He's walking around freely. Now this is the same guy that Putin called a traitor, right? And they worked out some sort of a deal where Putin's spokesman Peskov said he would escape retaliation. Now, there may have been conditions to that, like you stay in Belarus and don't show your fat face around here anymore in Russia. And now he's back in Russia. So, long story short, I can't explain how Prigozhin is allowed to roam around Petersburg and now Moscow. But I will harken back to our last interview, I think it was about 3 weeks ago, where you asked me whether I was confident that Putin was firmly in control. And I think I said 95% confident. And you said, what's the 5%? And I said, Prigozhin, I just can't figure out why they allow him to do the things that he does. So do I think Putin's firmly in control? Yeah, but it's not 95% in my view anymore. gotta be getting down around 60 or 50 if this guy is not put in his place. Again, it's a mystery wrapped up in an enigma, and Russia is really hard to figure out. And this one in particular. So I don't have a definitive answer, but it raises all kinds of questions as to what the heck's going on here. Bear in mind, the Wagner Group is an incredibly able fighting machine. They can help Lukashenko in Belarus a great deal. Okay. So he's happy to have them as long as they're under his control. So what's Prigozhin doing now, talking to his old Russian friend? I don't know, but that's as much as I do know, and conceding that there's a lot I don't know.
Yeah. Well, in our last conversation, there were rumors that Prigozhin might do something like this. And I had said that this reminded me of the Julius Caesar moment where the Republic of Rome Julius Caesar is coming back from years at war. He's mad with the senators, and they tell him, leave all of your weapons at the river, leave your men, and come in. And if you don't, there will be hell to pay. And Julius Caesar mounts up his men, and they cross the Rubicon, and they go in and they take out the Senate, and he makes himself emperor of the world. And that's what I think Prigozhin was like, okay, wait a minute. Do I have the backing of the people, MI6, the United States, and the CIA? If I do, then I'm going to cross the Rubicon. I'm going into Moscow, and I'm going to do this. And within a day, he realizes, I don't have the courage or the backing to take on Putin. And now he's in Belarus. So it's almost like a modern day, is he going to cross the Rubicon? And he did, but then he was very scared as soon as he got to the other side.
That's right, Stephen. It's a good analogy. The only problem is that the senators didn't have any army.
Yeah.
And Caesar did. Okay. Now, Prigozhin didn't have any army compared to the Ministry of Defense, the people that Moscow was able to array against him, in an hour to block that road. So again, it's Prigozhin with delusions of grandeur. It's this megalomania, which is so evident in his outbursts. And, this is an arrow in the quiver of every intelligence service. I mean, MI6, CIA, they can pander to this grandiosity, to kind of say, well, yeah, well, try it. Now, one of the interesting things I didn't mention is that Lavrov, the foreign minister, has been really, really careful not to charge the CIA and MI6 with involvement. Now, that doesn't say everything, but it does suggest to me that if he had better evidence, he would be pretty much forced to adduce it, or the KG, or the SVR and the others would be up in arms saying, look, these guys are doing it to us again, and you're too timid to point out the evidence. So that argues also against an active CIA, MI6 Western provocation here. I think there was a, nothing ventured, nothing gained attitude. Let him try. What's it to us? And he took a really, really bloody nose, but he's fixed his nose and he's back. I just don't understand how they let him back in Russia.
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of maybe being misled or war propaganda, we're being told that Ukraine and Russia and the rest of the world need to be on high alert because Zelensky says that Putin, after spending hundreds of millions of dollars, thousands of military lives, millions of dollars in equipment to capture the Zaporizhzhia power plant, that Russia is now going to blow it up and damage Western Ukraine and most of Europe and possibly the world. Russia's saying just the opposite. It's Ukraine that's coming in. We have control of the area. Why would we need to blow this up? What background or insight can you help us with to understand what's going on with this power plant situation?
This one's really easy, Stephen. Russians are winning hands down in Ukraine. You don't have to do a false flag once you are winning. Okay. Now, the false flag is on the Ukrainian side. The Russians have nothing to gain from leaking the power plant that they control. It's the biggest in Europe, by the way. It's a really big power plant. Now, much of it is shut down, but there's still the cooling pools, and all that kind of stuff can spew radiation. So, pure and simple, this was not only Zelensky, but the head of his military intelligence, and others all saying the Russians are going to do this. Watch for the Russians to do this. Now, there were wind pattern studies that I saw that showed that on a normal wind currency sort of day, most of those prevailing winds would go to go east toward Russia. Okay, but on the last night or the night before, maybe now, that's one of these unusual things where they go back into and they foul places like Hungary or Poland or Romania. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of people thought that on the night of the 5th, or to what's today, the 6th or tonight, that they would blow it. Now, I don't think they're going to blow it anymore. And that is the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, there were very specific reports as to what they wanted to do. It wasn't blow the whole plant up, it was to distribute some radioactive stuff that would blow toward Poland and be a distraction from the losing in Ukraine, and an indication how bad the Russians are prior to the NATO ministerial next Tuesday and Wednesday in Vilnius, Lithuania. The other thing I found interesting is that the reports yesterday said, "No, it looks like intense conversations with NATO top officials have dissuaded Zelensky, and there's not going to be any Zaporozhye blow-up." Huh. I got to thinking about that. Dissuaded Zelensky? Do you mean the Russians? No, Zelensky. So it's clear that even his NATO partners realize what the game was, okay? And I don't think if he does show up in Vilnius next Tuesday or Wednesday at the NATO ministerial, a guy that tries to blackmail other people, he's not usually welcome in polite circles. And you could argue how polite these circles are.
Yeah.
But, after coming down from this attempt to do this really disastrous false flag, having been weaned off it by these very people who are meeting in Vilnius, I don't know whether he'll get as warm a reception as he would otherwise get if he's allowed to go. And I think that he may be advised by his advisor, Victoria Nuland. Maybe you ought to pass this one up because they're not going to come through for you.
Yeah, I mean, think about if they had blown this and those winds took that radioactive dust into Poland or into Hungary. Those countries are already, Hungary is basically done with Ukraine, and Poland, they're waning on support because they're dealing with 5 million refugees that they are struggling to feed and house and clothe and get new jobs. And so it would have been an absolute disaster if they had blown this nuclear power plant. But again, for me, in my limited thinking, it's like, Putin spends $11 billion to complete Nord Stream 2 to Germany, and then they blow their own pipeline up with zero evidence. It's like, why would they expend all this energy? They've captured the area. They have full control of the power plant. Why would they need to blow it up? It made no sense to me.
Well, I think sometimes the common logic by the layperson is what should prevail. And of course, it does prevail in this instance. It would have been a terrible thing, no matter how much radioactive dust was released. But there are other terrible things happening. Depleted uranium shells going into these British tanks, or American tanks eventually, cluster munitions that are pretty much banned from civilized society now being approved and being touted by the likes of Lieutenant General Twitty on CNN. It's getting pretty bad. So this argues, in my view, in favor of those in Moscow are saying, Vladimir, let's get this damn thing over with, okay? Let's go. I mean, it's going to be muddy pretty soon, for God's sake. Let's go to the Dnieper and then ask them if they're willing to deal.
Yeah. Do you think Russia believes that they have a partner in trying to get peace, or do you think that they believe NATO is still out to get them?
Well, they have Lukashenko, of course, in Belarus, but that's about it. Well, that's not about it. McGovern misspoke. There's a country called China, okay, that's played a pivotal role in all this from the very beginning. Just to mention one sequence of events. On the 4th of February, 2022, Putin went up to visit Xi Jinping in Beijing to open the Winter Olympics. They signed on the 4th of February an incredible document saying that we're joined at the hip, we have common interests, our alliance exceeds a normal alliance in the world, okay? Now, my view, as I may have mentioned before, my view is that at that time, Putin was looking at his attempts to work out some sort of common security arrangement with the West as having completely failed, that the U.S. promises, to include a personal promise by President Biden not to put medium or intermediate range nuclear missiles in Ukraine, was dissed by his entourage and they wouldn't discuss it anymore. That the uptick in artillery strikes against the Donbas provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk was 10 times more than it had been in January. There were indications that the Ukrainian army, trained up to NATO standards, was just ready to go into the Donbas. So here's Putin saying to Xi Jinping, Xi, good friend, it looks like I'm going to have to invade Ukraine. I know that's against all your principles about Westphalia and non-interference in the internal, but hey, it's a core interest. You can understand that. You got a core interest in Taiwan. We're going to have to do it. What do you think? And she says, you mean after the Winter Olympics are over, right? And Putin, oh, of course. Now, the Winter Olympics are over on the 20th of February 2022. On the 21st, Lugansk and Donetsk declare themselves independent countries, are recognized by the Russian parliament. 2 days later, you have the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces. Now, am I saying that's the only reason that Putin thought it comfortable, all right, to go into there? No, it's not the only reason. I think he felt that he had to do that before they pounced on Lugansk and Donetsk. But certainly, well, not certainly. My view, having watched Sino-Soviet relations for 6 decades now, count them, is that that it is not likely that Putin would have done what he did in invading Ukraine if he didn't have at least a nihil obstat, okay, go ahead, do what you have to do, from Xi Jinping. That's how important I think it was. And now when you say, does he have any allies? Yeah, he sure as hell does. China realizes that's next on the U.S. list, for God's sake. And so China's going to give Putin all the support that he needs. He hasn't needed any military support just yet. But if it comes to that, remember where I heard it first, China will really give it to him so that he doesn't lose, because the stakes are very high. Putin himself cannot lose because he believes this to be an existential threat, a strategic threat to his country. Xi Jinping thinks that Putin should not lose, because if he lost, then he knows quite well from explicit authoritative American documents that China's next. And so they have a joint purpose here that never existed, never, ever in the history of the world. They're together as never before. And the clucks in Washington don't seem to understand that. We have Janet Yellen now in Beijing trying to repair relations. Well, she's not going to be able to make much difference at all. All she can do is say, okay, well, we still need that stuff that you give to Kmart and Walmart and all that kind of stuff. But the strategic realities are such that Ukraine is on the brink of losing definitively. Okay, it'll take a couple more weeks to make that apparent to everybody. Then what happens? The two options are Russians say, okay, are you ready to talk now? Or do you want us to go all the way to the Dnieper River, maybe even take Odessa, and then ask if you're ready to talk? The US has no way to combat that unless they want to raise the ante up to and including tactical nuclear weapons. God help us.
Yeah. Do you think so Zelensky has said that there's not going to be elections in Ukraine because he needs to continue to be the person that takes on Putin. But he originally won his election by saying that he would make peace with Putin. So doesn't he now have an opportunity to say, I'm fulfilling my campaign promise of making peace. Let's rebuild Ukraine. Let's bring 10 million to 15 million Ukrainian citizens back into the country and let's rebuild and be done with this? Or is his pride or pressure from NATO going to push this to the absolute brink until Ukraine just completely collapses?
Well, I think we have to see Zelensky as a puppet on the strings of not NATO, let's face it, Washington. Okay. What's Washington's purpose? Well, Washington has said, Defense Secretary Austin, the president himself, we're going to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. We're going to weaken Russia. That's the name of the game here. And if it takes killing what's left of the Ukrainian army, hey, it's too bad, but none of our boys are coming home. A couple of volunteers maybe, but nobody else coming home in coffins, okay? So if that's the idea, and if Raytheon and Lockheed are still smacking their lips, knowing that they're going to have to replace all these weapons that have been zapped by the Russians, I mean, is this a great country or what? So that's the primary thing, okay? The other thing is that even if Zelensky said, I'm president, I'm an actor, but maybe I stop just being a dramatis persona, and I'll be a real president of Ukraine, and I'll say, all right, we're on our own here. We're going to work out something with the Russians. Could he do that? No. Right after his election, which, as you point out, validly, he won on the strength of campaigning to improve Russia relations with Russia, he went out to the Donbass, where they were shelling Lugansk and Donetsk, and he said to these well-certified Nazi-type battalions, the Azov battalion or brigade, he said, look, we need to, we need to calm down on this front. Can you just halt these artillery strikes? And they looked at him and they said, the hell are you? And he said, oh, yeah, I was just elected president. I said, get out of here. Now, where does Montgomery get that? He gets that from Ukrainskaya Pravda. It was in the Pravda of Kiev, okay? That's what happened to Zelensky when he tried to rein in these guys. And as I say, 14,000 people over a period of 7 years, when meanwhile you're being diddled by the West by saying, oh yeah, we're trying to work out an arrangement like we agreed to, like the UN approved on Minsk. Watching all that, this time Putin's not going to be diddled, okay? He's admitted. He said, I shouldn't have waited so long. So now he's in there in full strength. I take no pleasure in this. People are dying every day. I mean, the first thing you do is you stop the bleeding, right? Well, that's not stopping. Why? Well, because unless there's some agreement to talk, And everyone from the president of Brazil to the Pope to Xi Jinping to, you know, just about everybody said, well, let's do that unless there's a ceasefire, which hopefully will happen whenever. The problem is it needs to happen yesterday, and it's not going to happen yesterday, and we'll have to see what the NATO people believe when they get together on Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. My fear is that they have been so misguided. I mean, if you look at what the head of the CIA has said publicly, you'd think that the Ukrainians can win this thing, that this is just a matter of time. I mean, he's in another world. I don't, he must have people who tell him what he wants to hear so that he can tell the president what he wants to hear. That couldn't be worse.
Just 2 days ago, he said one of the best things coming out of the Russia-Ukraine war is we're recruiting spies all over the world like crazy. It's a great time to be in espionage. And I was like, dude, read the room. Like, read the room. It was crazy to me. Now, you just brought up a really important point. This is why I love getting on with you, because you say little things that are like big to my brain, right? You said that the military industrial complex gets to vacuum up billions and billions and billions of American taxpayer dollars without losing any American lives. I know you didn't say it that way, but that's what this is. It didn't cross my mind. I know that they're making lots of money, but they can get away with it as long as Americans don't die. They don't care if Ukrainians die, and they're happy when Russians die, but where they get pressure to end the war or move on to the next war is when American troops start dying. But you're so right. They get access to all of this money without any of the pressure from Americans dying.
Yeah, the what I call the Mickey Matt, not just the Mick that Eisenhower talked about, the military-industrial complex. I call it, if you got a pencil, you might write this down. It's on the final. Okay. Military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Mickey Matt rhymes sort of with Mickey Mouse, so you can remember it. Okay. It's big. It's the way the MIC, the military industrial complex, has evolved, just as Eisenhower warned. Now, why do I say media in the middle there? Because media is the fulcrum, is the sine qua non. You can't do this stuff without the media completely distorting the threat. The media has most of us Americans persuaded that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, the Baltic states are next, and then Poland. There's not a scintilla of evidence that Putin or anybody else in Moscow has their designs on invading Poland or the Baltics or anywhere else. Ukraine is a special case. We were warned about that in 2008. As a matter of fact, Bill Burns, now head of the CIA, was warned about that personally by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He was called in and he said, Lavrov says, Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means? Burns said, well, yeah. He said, well, "niet" means "niet." Ukraine in NATO, that's a red line for us, okay? If you accept Ukraine in NATO, there will be a civil war. And we will have to decide, we Russians, as to whether we will have to intervene in that civil war or not. So "niet" means "niet." Tell your people back in Washington. Now, to his credit, Burns did that. The title of the cable is "Niet" means "niet," Russia's red line on NATO for Ukraine and Georgia, okay? And then he spelled this all out. It's really good cable. We have it thanks to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, okay? What did they do? Well, it was the last year of the Bush-Cheney administration. They just thumbed their nose and got the allies to approve to say in Bucharest in 2008, April, they said Ukraine and Georgia will become part of NATO. Well, that's a direct threat to Russia, especially the way it turned out, because in 2014, and many people don't realize this because it's not in the news, in 2014 came the most blatant coup in history. Just to refresh you, we overthrew, that is, the Western, playing on a lot of Nazi forces, pro-Nazi forces in Kiev. We overthrew the duly constituted, slightly pro-Russian, duly elected regime of Yanukovych in Kiev. Now, that involved a lot of double crossing, including calls from Obama to Putin, including calls from the Secretary of State to his opposite number in Russia, saying, "Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be all right. Just tell Yanukovych get out of town." Well, we know what happened. Okay. Now, Americans need to know this because this was advertised. This coup is the most blatant coup in history because it was advertised 2.5 weeks before on YouTube. No, I'm not kidding you. All right. There was an intercepted conversation between the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. ambassador in Kiev. His name was Jeffrey Pyatt. And they're arranging these people who would be coming in to take over the government. And they're saying, among other things, that, they have it all orchestrated. And if need be, if they need an international personage to come in and sort of concrete glue this deal, Joe Biden is available. Well, how do we know that, says the ambassador in Kiev? Well, we just got a cable from Jake Sullivan, who was Biden's national security advisor then as vice president, and now as president. And he tells us, yeah, Joe will come in and solidify the deal. That's all set up. Now they didn't need Joe to come in, but here are the Russians watching all this, right? Putin's in Sochi again, Olympics this time, Summer Olympics. Okay, he doesn't even come back to Washington until the day after the coup because, like me, he thought, well, that coup was blown. When you blow a coup on YouTube, it's not going to happen. Well, it did happen. And the results are what we see now. The Ukrainians immediately forbade Russian as an official language, even though more than 30% of the Ukrainians speak Russian as their primary language. And of course, they said, now we need to get into NATO. So the worst thing that could have happened to Russia at that point would be to have their only all year round ice-free naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea join NATO. Okay, so there were plebiscites there, and they voted to be annexed. Let's see, we use the right word, annexed to Russia. So that's the way it all started. And when you have a blatant coup like that, and people prefer to start history at the 23rd of July 23rd, the day after the coup. Okay, that's what they all start the history at. Putin decided to seize Crimea. Okay, well, there's not one scintilla of evidence that it ever entered his head or anybody else's head that they're gonna seize Crimea until there was a coup in Kiev on the 22nd of February 2014.
Oh, okay, wow. Your ability to see through the forest for the tree is incredible. It's amazing how the media still continues to say that this was unprovoked, and I mean, this is a decade in the making of betraying Russia over and over and over again until they felt like they had no other options, right? They're like backed into the corner and don't know where to go from here. So it'll be really interesting to see where this goes. So do you, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think that this thing wraps up by the end of summer, Or do you think by Thanksgiving and Christmas, you and I are still discussing this war situation?
You know, I've asked people who know more about the military situation than do I, and asked all kinds of other trusted advisors and friends. Nobody knows. And one really wise fellow says, Ray, there's only one person knows that. I said, who's that? Putin. Okay. Now, what happens in Vilnius next week will be important. Will NATO decide to double down yet once again, send more weaponry and try to send it quicker? Well, they're not going to be able to send it quickly enough, let us say, to prevent the Russians from going all the way to the Dnieper if they decide to do that. It's just, you know, they're late to the party. They can't get there on time. And we've been saying that for months. A formal memo to President Biden in January 26th. We veteran intelligence professionals for sanity wrote that in a memo. Okay. So that being the case, what's Putin going to decide to do? One option is attrition. They've had incredible success in attriting, if you will, the Ukrainian army. It's down to half of what it was. And they continue to do that during the Ukrainians' so-called counteroffensive. It's a winning strategy. Why wouldn't they just keep doing that until it's really clear that they have carte blanche to move all the way to the Dnieper? That's one option, okay? Well, problem with that is those Abrams tanks and those F-16s, they'll come late, but do we want to wait until they come? Why not finish off the thing right now? We've got the momentum. We've shown that the counteroffensive is no good. Even NATO should be able to realize that if and when we go forward all the way to the Dnieper. We can make a deal then. You know, we have a demilitarized zone. It's a natural thing. Odessa, Odessa is on the western side of the Dnieper River. We could share ownership or government of Odessa with what's left of the Ukrainian government. I mean, there are ways we can allow Ukraine to be a viable state, which will require access to the sea. Okay, otherwise they're just a big farm for the rest of Europe. Okay, so we can work these things out. But if your objective is to weaken Russia, is to give Russia a strategic defeat, and all the while make tons of money replenishing and making more arms and all that kind of stuff, well, then that's a problem, okay? So, you know, if I were advising Putin, I don't know what I'd say, but I'd have to go up against Surovikin, who has been masterful in saying, well, this attrition is working, let's keep doing it, and then hope that somebody like Lavrov will say, yeah, but, and Shoigu, the defense minister, yeah, but it's going to get even worse. That the NATO is never going to be able to concede defeat unless it's so manifest that they have no other choice. And I fear that that's going to be the case, and therefore this thing could slide onto the muddy season, so to speak, and then into the winter, and then into next year. God, I hope that doesn't happen, because people are being killed, and it's time to stop the carnage.
Yeah, it is. Well, no one's going to be watching the NATO meeting closer than Vladimir Putin, but you'll be watching it. I'll be watching it, and we'll return to report what's gonna or what it looks like is going to happen. Ray McGovern, thank you again for coming on our show. If people want to learn more, is raymcgovern.com still the best place to do that?
That's a good website, and it's easily searchable, I should add. And the other way would be my Twitter feed is simply at Ray McGovern.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on today's show.
You're most welcome, Stephen. It's always good to be with you.